A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never together with Jewish History Soundbites, and this is another installment. Yes, last week we'll call it last week's was a tribute, a more personal tribute to Rabbi Berel Wein. This week is more of a standard Jewish History Soundbites episode about the life and times of Rabbi Berel Wein, less personal, more about his biography and accomplishments, his life and times, the Jewish world that he was operating in and which raised him, less personal, more of a general history. I got tremendous feedback from last one, and I actually was quite hesitant to do a second one, but literally tens, maybe even more than tens of emails, texts, phone calls that I got, and almost all of them encouraged me to do a second one, so I'm assuming that there's a desire to hear more broader historical profile of his life. The main source of it is himself. He wrote an autobiography about his life, and I always thought it was too short. It's called Teach Them Diligently, the personal story of a community rabbi. It's excellent. It's really excellent. I always thought it was needs even more. There's it's too slim. There's a lot more information that could have been in it, and I mentioned to a couple of his grandchildren that he should have, to encourage him to redo it and expand it away. I guess that will now be up to his biographers. He also scattered through some of his other books or lectures that are recorded, conversations that he had, and anecdotes he shared. There's always stuff about his own life and the world that he grew up in. And also over the past week or so, since his passing, I've heard some tributes that I've read or heard. There's also an excellent article published in the Ami magazine by my good friend Rabbi Wein's nephew, Rabbi Mordechai Kamenetsky, and I got some excellent stories from there as well, so thank you. So we'll go through a little bit of that, and hopefully it will not be any repeating from last week. So, if I would read some of the great feedback I get, it would take the whole episode. So I'm not going to read any of the feedback, even though I got tons of great stories and feedback. I want to read one, though, just because I thought it was very powerful and it said a lot. So I'm going to just use one example. I also got permission from this listener to share it, so I always don't want to infringe on any privacy, God forbid. So here I actually got permission, so that's another reason that I could share this one. I just listened to your tribute. I will share my own Rabbi Wein story with you. Some years ago, Rabbi Wein came to my town to the Jewish book fair as a speaker. I think he had released a new book. I went up to him and said, Rabbi Wein, I've been meaning to thank you for the last few decades. He said, why? I said, I'm one of the guys who were schlepped off to the Kotel in the 1980s, and I ended up in Esha Torah. I had a hard time. It was a roller coaster for me. Is there a God? There isn't a God. Torah from Sinai, Torah not from Sinai. It took me a few years to get with the program. I said, while I was struggling, it was your history tapes that kept me locked in. Side A on the way to work, side B on the way home. Reb Noach Weinberg Zatzal gave me Torah, but you gave me the Jewish people and my history. He looked at me with the biggest ear-to-ear smile and exclaimed, thank you for telling me that. It was a very moving moment. That was beautiful. So I want to get into the story here, and I want to first explain the rather strange choice of title I did for this episode. I guess journalists made this up because sociologists and historians tend to be very critical of this generational divide. They feel that it's stereotyping and it's incorrect and it's artificial and it's inaccurate and yada, yada, yada. So I think it's, completely a social construct fabricated by journalists and others about which generation, where generations start and end, and the titles that we give to these different generations based on all kinds of stereotypes. So in there's what's referred to as the greatest generation. I think it's specifically in the United States, but it's used worldwide also. I'm not even sure myself. That the greatest generation is the ones who came of age, were born and came of age in the 1920s, and then served in, or lived through, and many of them served in World War II. And then there's the silent generation, ones who were born in the late 1920s and 1930s and early 1940s. They're considered the silent generation. And then the ones who are born after the war are considered the baby boomers, or the boomers. Right? And then, of course, there's, I don't even know, what's that afterwards is Generation X and millennials. I think I'm a millennial, if I'm not mistaken. And then there's Gen Z, which is causing all the problems today. No, I'm kidding. So, the what I'm focusing on the earlier ones. There's the greatest generation, the silent generation, and then baby boomers. And generational theory in this context says that the reason they're the greatest generation is because they grew up with the hardships of the first the booming the roaring 20s, and then the hardships of the Great Depression, and then they go ahead and serve their country in various capacities, not only in combat and various other capacities during World War II, and they're the ones who stood up to defeated the Nazis and Japanese imperialism and built the world that we have, and raised families afterwards, and they're the greatest generation, right? That's one generation. Then you have the silent generation, so-called silent generation, who are in the greatest generation's shadow, so to speak. They grow up in the Great Depression. They grow up during the war. They're still children. So they're products of two rough decades of childhood and adolescence. And then they go on to live very, I guess simple is the wrong word. They go on to live regular, quietish lives, and working in manufacturing and in cities, and with not a great amount of political upheaval, according to this theory, obviously. And then they're followed by the boomer generation, the baby boomers, who are born to the World War II generation, and they create the revolutions and the social justice movements, civil rights movement, and the anti-Vietnam War movement of the 1960s, and that's the trajectory of this generational theory, right? Now, anyone who, most people who take themselves seriously don't like this generational divide because it's artificial, it's a construct, it's stereotypical, and it's very often completely inaccurate. But despite all of its limitations, I find it to be useful, and I think that it's a tool. As much as it's fabricated and made up and inaccurate, it could be a helpful tool in understanding both American history, which is what it's created for, but also to understanding Jewish history in the American context. I think there is a certain usefulness for it. The world of the Jewish America of the greatest generation is the immigrant generation. They're immigrants and children of immigrants who are trying to make it work, having left their country behind, mostly in Eastern Europe and Tsarist Russian Eastern Europe, or other places, and they're trying to make it work. And very often their religion falls by the wayside. They're integrating into American society. They're assimilating even into American society, and they're struggling, and they want to make a better future for their children who become Americanized in the process. That's the parallel to the greatest generation. Then there's the silent generation, which is very silent, because it's the boomers who create the American Jewish society that we know today, the post-war generation. Whether it's in the Jewish context, it would not only be those born in the 40s and 50s, it would be the survivors who arrived in the 40s and 50s. So it's not exactly baby boomers, it's Jewish immigrants to the United States after the war, survivors, refugees, coming and building a Jewish life. And they're the ones who, and then of course, boomers themselves, the baby boomers themselves, the Jewish Americans, and they build the American post-war Jewish community. And then there's these years in between the immigrant generation of pre-war and the builders of American Jewish life post-war that essentially is the silent generation. And Rabbi Berel Wein was a member of this so-called silent generation. He's born in 1934, so officially the silent generation is 1928 to 1945, if I'm not mistaken. And there's not much noise coming from his generation. And I think we don't give them enough credit. American-born Jewish children born in the 1930s, in other words, they belong to the post-war generation, children of immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe to the United States, as builders of post-war America. We tend to usually look at very binary. There's the pre-war America, which is the immigrant generation who mostly secularized and integrated into American society. And then there's the post-war America, either survivors or children of immigrants who stood up to the challenge and built America. And this is this kind of like in between. People like Rabbi Wein, and there's quite a few others who don't get enough credit. They're from that in-between generation who grew up in pre-war America and saw the previous generation, saw the immigrant generation, and they took that in a very American context. They're American-born. They're American pre-war American-born. There's a big difference because post-war American-born already lives in a different Jewish America. And here they are very much contributing to the building of American Orthodoxy, American Jewry in the post-war world. And I think that he kind of encapsulated that both in his own life, and I even found it to be very true in part of the introduction he wrote to his own autobiography. And I just want to read I selected two paragraphs to read from the introduction to his own autobiography that I think really brings out this point. Obviously, he doesn't talk about the generational theory. So here's a quote from his the introduction to his autobiography. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, the remarkable and holy editor of the Mishnah, attributed his greatness in Torah and piety to the fact that he once saw Rabbi Meir's back. He stated that had he seen him face to face, he would have been even greater. Well, I was privileged to see Eastern European Jewry's back through my family and teachers, and I feel compelled to share those experiences with my descendants. They've asked me about my parents and grandparents, my teachers, and the distinguished people I've been honored to meet and know, the events private and national that help shape my outlook, and the twists and turns of life. That's one paragraph. Later on in that same introduction, he writes another thing that I also found dovetails with this. I consider myself privileged to have lived in this era of great and awesome events. I was fortunate that my parents immigrated to the United States, sparing me the fate of my many cousins in Eastern Europe during World War II. I also lived during a good time in the United States, benefiting from a decline of anti-Semitism and a new openness in American life. I saw the injustices done to people of color in America begin to be corrected by legislation and societal behavior. I was privileged to witness and participate in the renaissance of Orthodox Jewish life in America and Israel. I experienced the realization of the age-old Jewish dream with the establishment and continued growth of the State of Israel and its ingathering of the exiles. I have been able to live my latter years in the holy city of Jerusalem and even to serve as the rabbi of a prestigious congregation there. And I have been privileged to see the fourth generation of my immediate family. So he kind of like sees himself as part of this bridge, so to speak. So that bridge is, he has these roots in Lithuania, rabbinical roots, right? Very strong yeshivish Lithuanian, Litvish roots. This kind of like comes from like this aristocracy of the Lithuanian rabbinate and the Litvish yeshivas, and they end up in Chicago. And how they end up in Chicago on both sides of his family is fascinating. And what was Chicago at that time, in pre-war Chicago? So Jewish Chicago in the early 1900s is this center of immigration, very similar to New York. In fact, Chicago, people are shocked when I tell them this on trips sometimes. In fact, I just had a group from Chicago a few weeks ago in Europe. We did a Europe tour, and I told them this. They said that I told them that in the 1920s and 30s, Chicago was the second largest Jewish community in the world after New York. In other words, not Warsaw, not Lodz, not Odessa, Moscow, definitely not Budapest, right? Not even Lakewood, by the way, or Yerushalayim. Chicago was the second largest Jewish community in the world, right? It's a massive, after New York. New York is always the biggest. For many years, as far as I know, it's still the biggest in the world. I don't think there's a single city in Israel that has a larger Jewish population than New York, as far as I know, unless you count like the Tel Aviv area, you throw in Ramat Gan and Petach Tikva and all those other cities. But anyways, I'm not getting into current day Jewish demographics. We're talking about history there. So Jewish Chicago in the 1920s, 30s is this massive center, huge, hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Chicago, almost all of them immigrants. There's not much of a, 19th century, a little bit of remnants of an old Jewish community in Chicago, but it's almost entirely composed of recent immigrants from Eastern Europe. And what's going on is rapid secularization and even assimilation. Eventually, if we skip ahead to the 1940s, 1950s, then there's this marked shift to conservative Judaism in the next generation. Many Orthodox shuls convert to conservative Judaism in Chicago. And in fact, Rabbi Wein in his autobiography describes growing up in the 1930s, going to Chicago Cubs games as a Chol Hamoed Pesach trip, right? Obviously, a Chol Hamoed Pesach trip, a Chol Hamoed Sukkos trip would be problematic because the Cubs didn't really make it to the World Series that often in those times. But Chol Hamoed Pesach, it's the beginning of the season, they could. And he describes how all the Jews went, and they all brought matzah sandwiches to eat during the game, and everyone's crunching in the stands. This way he described it in the autobiography is that it sounded like Wrigley Field was being taken down by termites because of all this crunching in the stands, which led me to think of a new take on the Curse of the Billy Goat, which, as is well known, was in 1945, and when the last time they made the World Series, until finally, and I think they broke it in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. But the Curse of the Billy Goat was because this goat and its owner were thrown out of Game 4 of the World Series in 1945. So based on Rabbi Wein's account of the matzah crunching in the stands in Wrigley Field, so my own understanding of the Curse of the Billy Goat was deepened because this is a symbol. 1945, end of the war, post-war generation of American Jewry, especially in places like Chicago, is this mass secularization, this mass shift of Orthodox Jewry, of the immigrant generation to conservative Judaism, and complete secularization and even assimilation of the children of the immigrants. So there's this shift away from Judaism, from Orthodox Judaism, a shift away from Orthodox Judaism. And 1945 is a symbol of that. And that's why the Cubs don't deserve to win the World Series, because there's no longer that hearing the crunching of matzah in the stands, because Jews in Chicago aren't eating matzah so much on Pesach anymore. From that time on, there's this secularization taking place. And that's why it's the billy goat curse, because a goat is the Korban Pesach, right? It's a symbol of the Korban Pesach. So only in 2016, when Orthodox Judaism by then is revitalized in Chicago with yeshivas and kollel and everything, then of course the Cubs deserve to win the World Series again, and the curse of the billy goat is over. But in any event, I spoke about Chicago Jewish history. I had an episode back in the day, several years ago. You could check it out. There's a lot of this background of what Jewish Chicago is like at that time. And this is the world that Rabbi Wein is growing up in. Rabbi Wein himself, when he would say stories about his growing up, he would say that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who would say this about himself, that Hashem leaves old people around to tell the story of what it once was. To tell, Shalavicha v'yageidcha zakeinecha v'yoimru lach. The old people are left around by God to tell the story of the Jewish people. And that's why people like Rabbi Wein were a bridge to a different generation. And he would be, he's a connection to people like his father-in-law, Rabbi Eliezer Levine, who was a rabbi in this little tiny shtetl in Lithuania, Vashki, or Vashki, not Vashti, Vashki. And he decides, he's dire poverty. It's this tiny little shtetl. And he moves to the United States, and he saw that there was no future in the United States, because he became a rabbi in a place called, this Rabbi Eliezer Levine, became a rabbi, Talmud of the Chavetz Chaim, student of the Kelm Yeshiva. Well, great tzaddik, a great rabbi. He's first a rabbi in Erie, Pennsylvania, and he's walking to shul in the snowstorm. And the Reform rabbi is driving to his temple, and he sees this European Litvish Rav, Talmud of the Chavetz Chaim, and he rolls down his window and he says, it's Friday night, it's Shabbos, and he's the Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer Levine, is walking in the snow, and the Reform rabbi is in his car. And the Reform rabbi lowers his window and says, Rabbi, get in the car. Meaning, there's no future for people like you in America. Don't even bother. Don't. It's not worth it. So he said he took he didn't take the offer. He took the words of this Reform rabbi to heart, and he decided to go back to Lithuania. And Rabbi Eliezer Levine's sister stole his passport. He said, don't go back to Lithuania. Stay in America and make it work. This is 1938. You could just imagine what would have happened had he gone back to Lithuania in 1938 and stayed there. That would be the end of his family a couple of years later, 3 years later. Summer of 1941 is when 90% of Lithuanian Jewry is murdered in the Holocaust by the SS Einsatzgruppen and their local Lithuanian collaborators. Instead, because his sister stole his passport, he brings his family over to the United States, and he eventually becomes a rabbi in Detroit. Rabbi Wein's wife, who I remember well when I used to eat Shabbos meals by Rabbi Wein, she was Rebbitzin Jackie. Rebbitzin Jackie, with this real American name. It was Yocheved. She was born in Kelm. She's a Litvish immigrant, but she became Jackie because Yocheved wasn't really a cool name to have in an American public school in Detroit in those days. And so she couldn't be Yocheved, she had to be Jackie. Even though Rabbi Wein himself told me that Berel, which was such a Jewish name, he kept it, and he eventually was very proud of it. I don't know, maybe that's the difference, being an only child. He was an only child, she wasn't, I'm not sure. Either way, interesting thing about names, about Jewish names at that time. In any event, Rabbi Wein's father was Rabbi Zev Wein. Also, I met once or twice. His father was a student first in Slobodka and then of Reb Shimon Shkop in Grodno. And then later in Yerushalayim, in Merkaz Harav. He was a student of Rav Kook in Merkaz Harav, probably one of the first, maybe the first class of Merkaz Harav. But the Reb Shimon Shkop was fundraising in 1929. I think I spoke about this on a podcast once. And Reb Shimon Shkop decided to stay in America, and he became Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, and he told alumni of his to come to America, to join him there in America. Eventually, Reb Shimon went back to Europe under lots of pressure, but that's a story for another time. I think I talked about it in a podcast once. But in any event, so one of the alumni who heeded Reb Shimon's call, who heeded his Rebbe's call to come to America, was Rabbi Wein's father, Reb Berel Wein. He was known as Reb Berel Chulin because at one point they didn't have an entire shas in Grodno, and Rabbi Wein's father was tasked with memorizing Chulin to be the living Chulin for the whole yeshiva, for the whole Grodno yeshiva. So he was Velvel Chulin. Everyone would ask him questions about Chulin. That's amazing. But in any event, Reb Shimon Shkup told Reb Velvel Chulin, Reb Zev Wein, he told him in 1929, that's 4 years before Hitler comes to power, that's 10 years before World War II breaks out, that's 12, 13 years before the final solution begins. Reb Shimon Shkup said, 1929, Europe is schon ausgespielt. Europe has played itself out, and the future of Torah and Yiddishkeit is in the United States and Israel. He didn't say Israel, Eretz Yisrael. There was no Israel yet then. So that was Reb Shimon Shkup's view. So interesting that, and that's how Reb Zev Wein ended up in America. And so how did, so you know, you have, he was known actually in Merkaz Arav, he was known as Velvel Ratsker, because he was from this shtetl in Lita called Ratsky, something like that. Never ended up in these Litvische shtetlach. They're small places. Rav Kook used to say about Rabbi Wein's father, Velvel Ratsker is my bookcase. Amazing how he had this reputation of just knowing everything. So you have this Velvel Wein coming to America, Blazer Levine coming to Detroit. By the way, when Blazer Levine was in Detroit, so he, being that he was prominent already as a Rav in Europe, so he was close with everybody. So Rebbe Meir Bloch, the Yeshiva of Telz, was friends with Rebbe Eliezer Levine from Lithuania. And Rebbe Meir Bloch unfortunately lost his entire family in the Holocaust. He eventually remarried, had a new family, but for a bunch of years he was a widower. And he used to go for Pesach to Detroit, because he was a widower, and it was, Telz Yeshiva was Bein Hazmanim, right? There was no one around. So Rebbe Eliezer Levine would host Rebbe Meir Bloch for Pesach during the years that he was a widower. So Rebbe Meir Bloch was would interact with the Levine girls, right? Rebbetzin Jackie Wein would say this story. She was one of the Levine girls. Rebbe Meir Bloch would teach them at this time. Can't get away with these stuff today. He would teach them an Echad Mi'odea song from the Haggadah. He taught it to them and then sang it with them. And he sang it with them 6 or 7 times until he was confident that they knew it well, until they sang it to him. And he was confident that they had mastered the song and that they would, and he told them, and now you'll remember this song for the rest of your life. Great story. Elia Meir Bloch, that tells the Rosh Yeshiva. But getting back to Reb Zev Wein. So Reb Zev Wein, when he came to New York, he won a Torah prize, like being the best Talmud Chacham, best Talmud in Reb Shimon Shkup's Shir in 1930 in YU, whatever it was. However you become the best, I don't know what that, whatever the criteria were. So there was a $500 prize for being the best. The $500 prize was sponsored by Israel Rokeach, who was a Jew from Kovna, who had immigrated to the United States and had this kosher food company. Started off with kosher soap. It was called Jewish soap because it was half blue and half red. You broke the bar of soap in half, and the blue you used for one you used for milchiks and one you used for fleishiks. I don't know which one was which. In any event, so he was wealthy from this soap business and eventually kosher food business, this Israel Rokeach. So he sponsored these prizes, these cash prizes for the best young budding Torah scholars in America, and one of them who won it was Rabbi Berel Wein. So now, in the beginning of the Great Depression, this new immigrant had $500, which was huge. So Rabbi Dov Bernard Revel, he wanted to help him find the shidduch, and he's a good catch now because he had $500. So he said, he said, in Chicago, there's a man named Reb Chaim Tzvi Rubinstein, a student of the Volozhin yeshiva of the Nitziv in Volozhin. He's a rabbi in Chicago. And he has 3 daughters. You'll probably like one of them, so go, meet all 3 and see which one you like and marry one of them, so you get a shidduch. That's how his shidduch was made, and that's how he ended up in Chicago. How did Reb Chaim Tzvi Rubinstein get to Chicago? Reb Chaim Tzvi Rubinstein was a student of Volozhin of the Nitziv, and he decided after the Volozhin yeshiva closed down, he decided to move to Eretz Yisrael under the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. And he ends up in Yafo, and he opens a yeshiva called Sharei Torah, which is how Rabbi Wein's yeshiva in Muncie came to be called Sharei Torah. It was named after his grandfather's yeshiva in Yafo in the early 1900s. As far as I know, the original Sharei Torah building in Yafo still exists, unless it's already been torn down by now. So that was one of the first yeshivas in the new yeshuv, in the outside Yerushalayim, outside the old yeshuv towns. So Sharei Torah by Talmud of Volozhin, Reb Chaim Tzvi Rubinstein. Now, during World War I, he gets stuck in America, and Ottoman Turks were fighting in World War I, so he ends up in America, and the Jewish community in Chicago agreed to help him out. He got in trouble with the law because he was a foreign citizen, a foreign national, a war, that they're at war with, whatever it was. I don't know the exact story, but they basically got him out of the, trouble got his residence permit legalized on condition that he would stay there as the rabbi in Chicago. So he kind of was, forced into to be become the rabbi in Chicago of this Jewish community. And then he went ahead and is one of the several founders of Beis Medrash LaTorah, Hebrew Theological College, the first yeshiva in Chicago. So he's founding yeshivas wherever he went. So they all get to Chicago. That's how they get to Chicago. So there's these Litvisher rabbis in Chicago, and these Litvisher rabbis, some of them are involved in this first yeshiva, who then goes ahead and hires all these other Litvisher rabbanim, some of them refugees from the Holocaust, some of them who came earlier, and it's this golden age of the Chicago yeshiva in the fact that there's all these old school Slabotka students and great, huge tzaddikim, huge scholars, educators, great people, and that's what he's raised in. That's what Rabbi Wein is raised in. Rabbi Wein used to say a story about how these Rebbeim would teach them, educate them for life, not only teach them Torah. They would teach them how to live, how to be good people, how to be good Jews. So one time they were told that they have to stand up for the non-Jewish teachers teaching general studies in the school. So Rabbi Wein and his friends asked Mendel Kaplan, who was one of the Rebbeim, why do we have to stand up for the non-Jewish teacher? So Mendel Kaplan said, if you stand up for the non-Jewish teacher, maybe you'll stand up for your Rebbeim also. That was the situation at that time. He said half of the yeshiva, half of his class in the Chicago yeshiva. Now think about it. These are parents sending their kids to yeshiva in Chicago in the 1940s. Everyone else was sending to public school. These are the best, the cream of the cream, and the creme de la creme. And he said half of them came from non-Shabbos observant homes, which is amazing. And they all came out. They came out rabbis, great people, great laymen, great everything. Reb Chaim Kreisworth, who was his main Rebbe there, was the only non-Litvak, and he became his main Rebbe. He came from a Hasidic home in Krakow. He was known as the Krakower Ilui. He was Reb Reb Chaim Kreiswirth was the superstar of Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, which was a Hasidic yeshiva, but eventually he married a Litvak, so I guess that's what made him a little bit of a Litvak. So a huge genius. Reb Chaim Kreiswirth was, we should have an episode on Reb Chaim Kreiswirth one day. Amazing story. In any event, he's the main Rebbe in Chicago. He's Rabbi Wein's main Rebbe, and he writes his rabbinical ordination, his smicha. And Reb Chaim Kreiswirth says to Rabbi Wein, you should become a Rav because we need rabbis, we need leaders, we need to build Yiddishkeit, we need to build Orthodox Judaism in Chicago and the United States after the war. But on the other hand, it seemed like the conservative Judaism was winning, especially outside New York City in places like Chicago in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, because they were taking over America. There was no chance that Rabbi Wein was going to get any rabbinical position. Just to give a little context, every shul in Chicago, again, this was taking place all over the United States, I would say outside of New York City in the 1940s and 50s. It's sometimes known as the death of orthodoxy. When the immigrant generation is passing on, the children of immigrants are either integrating, assimilating into American society, completely secularizing, or at best, they're converting their synagogues from Orthodox to conservative. In Chicago, 42 Orthodox shuls, only a few years later, only 6 were still Orthodox. The rest had either closed down completely or become conservative. And the Rabbi Wein's father, he was offered a position in a shul that had no mechitza. And he said to Rabbi Wein, and this is what made Rabbi Wein stay away from the rabbinate, because he didn't want to have to confront this choice of compromising and of, that's it, everything's becoming conservative, and that's what pushed him to become a lawyer, was this story. His father said, I saw Reb Shimon Shkop, so I can't compromise. I can't be in a place that's taking down their mechitza. So maybe people who didn't see Reb Shimon Shkop, they can, they don't feel, they don't have that connection. But I have that connection. I saw Reb Shimon, so I can't do that. And he tells that to his son. So Rabbi Wein says that, I can't become a rabbi in a situation like that I'm going to have to face compromises like that. So he became a lawyer instead. So now just to understand, we very often on this podcast speak about the 19th century and secularization. The 19th century, the symbol of, let's say in Hungary, in the Chassam Sofer's Austro-Hungarian Empire, especially in the generation after the Chassam Sofer's passing, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire by the students of the Chassam Sofer, the fight over orthodoxy and the neolog, which was the Hungarian version of reform, was the placement of the bima. If the bima is up front, it's neolog, it's non-traditional, it's the Hungarian version of reform. And if it's in the middle, that means it's orthodox. That became the visual, that became the symbol. In America, in the 1940s and 50s, again, outside of New York City, the death of orthodoxy, the change, the shift from orthodoxy to conservative was the mechitza. That became the visual, that became the symbol. The fights over the mechitza, the fights over keeping the mechitza up or tearing it down. The compromise, if I allow the mechitza to go down, then I can preserve, that many rabbis were willing to make that compromise to see if they can salvage something by, giving in to that, or fighting, or those fighting to keep it up, or those shuls that just completely got rid of it and they, became officially conservative. The mechitza became the battleground. This is which is important for context, because now you understand a lot of these questions about mechitza and the height of the mechitza and doing different things about the mechitza and the placement of the mechitza, because it became this huge issue. And is there any way to cut corners that we can officially still call the synagogue Orthodox? So to keep the mechitza, as long as we keep the mechitza, it's Orthodox. The symbol of it changing to conservative is taking it down, that there's no longer a mechitza. Now, Rabbi Chaim Kreiswirth, who Rabbi Wein remained in touch with throughout his life, eventually prevailed, and he became a rabbi. So that's how he became a rabbi. He's a rabbi in Miami, and then later on, when he was still I think I mentioned this in the first part, when he was still a lawyer in Chicago, he was one of the crucial role in founding the Telz Yeshiva in Chicago, and he even had a part-time rabbi volunteer job. I don't think he got paid to be a rabbi in Chicago, but he was eventually a rabbi in Miami. He's the rabbi of OU Kashrus, rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva in Muncie. He was a rebbe in Miami also in the yeshiva there, and then he was in Rosh Yeshiva in Muncie, in Shari Torah. Base Torah was this shul, and then he retired to Israel, where he became a rabbi in Beit Knesset Anasi and a rebbe in Ar Sameach. And then, of course, he was teaching history and books and the tapes and all that we spoke of. By the way, he once described, I don't know, I remember I read it somewhere maybe, about how the tapes came about. That he started giving these history classes in Muncie to women. Because, men, it's only Daf Yomi or something like that. So the women, you could teach Jewish history. And, of course, the men got jealous because their wives became so knowledgeable and connected to their past and to Jewish history. So they wanted a shiur also. So I don't know if he made it for both or he made another one for men, whatever it was. I don't remember exactly. But some of the men weren't able to come to the shiur. And he said it was mainly doctors because, unlike many other professions, doctors are less flexible in their schedules. And therefore, a bunch of doctors, physicians in the shul, they came to him and they said, it's not fair, we can't attend the history class, and we heard it's fascinating, it's awesome. So can you record it? And that's how the cassette tapes came about, because a bunch of doctors in Muncie couldn't come to the history classes. It's unbelievable that, like, this huge revolution. Podcasts today it's like a dime a dozen, and like the whole audio world exploded. But in the 1970s, I think that's when it started, maybe the 1980s, no one did this. What was around then? I mean, who was doing taped shiurim in the 1970s and 80s, especially on Jewish history? There was no other, you didn't have this whole audio world. And how did it come about? Not because Rabbi Wein thought himself, hey, let me disseminate Jewish history to the entire world and maybe hundreds of thousands of people around the world will listen. That's not what he envisioned. He couldn't dream that would happen. Again, he's a rabbi in Rosh Yeshiva giving history classes to his community at this time. Why did it happen? Because a couple of physicians in the shul couldn't attend the class and they asked him to record it. And eventually these tapes got around and it has this snowball effect, which is unbelievable. How a pioneering venture. And then he embraces technology by making movies and the whole foundation out of it. Now, what I found, I mentioned this briefly last time, but I found one to be one of his strongest points, which made his appeal much broader, was that he stayed apolitical. And the politicization of the Jewish people in the 20th century is a huge topic, maybe for another time. But that's how he was able to speak at completely unaffiliated audiences. He spoke also at secular audiences. He spoke at conservative and reform audiences. He spoke at federations across the country. And he was also speaker at the Aguda Convention and everything in between. When he left Miami for New York, he was offered a job in Agudas Yisrael and Yeshiva University at the same time. Turned them both down. He was probably the only American Orthodox rabbi in history who was so versatile and unboxable that you couldn't categorize him, that what type of orthodoxy is he, right? He's, right? And that's why he was able to be so close with people like the Satmar Rav and the Panovich Rav and all kinds of other streams. It didn't make a difference. When the Satmar Rav came down to Miami and Rabbi Wein was close with him then, I think I spoke about last week about how he used, the Satmar Rav used Rabbi Wein's mikveh because people were saying that it's not kosher. Who's this young, clean-shaven rabbi who made a mikveh? And the Satmar Rav said, it's fine, it's a good mikveh. But Rabbi Wein invited the Satmar Rav to come speak at the school, at the Jewish day school there. So the Satmar Rav says, do they teach general studies in the school? So Rabbi Wein said, yes. So the Satmar Rav said a mashal, a parable. He said there was a guy who came to a restaurant and said, and ordered soup, and there were flies in the soup. So he says to the waiter, if it doesn't make a difference to you that there's flies in the soup, then maybe just serve the flies separately on a different plate. And that was Satmar Rav's response, and he wouldn't speak in the school. So, they had their differences of opinion, but, there's no There was no, they personally were very close. In fact, the Satmar Rav, another story with him and Rabbi Wein, is that he gave him advice as a rabbi to rabbi advice. He said that as a young Rav back in Hungary before the war, he found that if a rabbi should be well versed in the halachas of a puzzle Sefer Torah, because that you're put on the spot in public and you have to respond right away, because it's the middle of laning, Shabbos morning, the whole shul is there, men and women, everyone's hungry for the Kiddush, and you have to decide on the spot, otherwise everyone's going to run to Kiddush Club and forget about it, and you have to figure out if something's wrong with the Sefer Torah. And if you don't have those halachas cold, you don't have it on the spot, you're not able to answer, then that really is detrimental for you as a young, newly hired rabbi. And he said, the Satmar Rav said he learned that from experience. He himself went through that when he was a young Rav, and he advised Rabbi Wein to study those halachas as well, which I found to be a nice, cute little story. He was also close to Rabbi Kamenetsky, first in Miami, and then later on in New York, in Muncie. They lived together in Muncie. One story was that he was driving Rabbi Yaakov, and they came through a toll booth, and Rabbi Wein said, and Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said to Rabbi Wein, "You didn't thank the guy and the person in the toll booth. You didn't thank them. They gave you change. You gave them money. They gave you change. You should thank them. The derech eretz, right? That's he said that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, when he taught Bava Basra in Torah V'das, he was starting the first parak of Bava Basra. He would say, "Hashutafin shecholku sherotz," whatever. They wanted to make a mechitza. I forget the exact language of the Mishnah. But even though the normal yeshivish way of saying it is hashutfin, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who is very particular about dikduk, would go out of his way to say hashutafin. Parenthetically, I just want to mention that my Rebbe in the Mir, Rabbi Sharieli, did the same exact thing. Does the same exact thing, hashutafin. So I guess Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rabbi Sharieli, the only Rebbeim in the world who do dikduk. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky helped Rabbi Wein in Muncie. There were people who were not happy with Rabbi Wein's new yeshiva and his and whatever it was, and Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky publicly backed Rabbi Wein. In fact, even earlier, when Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was in Miami, people would come to him for questions regarding something in the community. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky would say, "I don't live here. There's a local rabbi." What do you mean? You're the Gadol Adar? You're Das Torah? He said, "But I don't live here. Local questions are for local rabbis. And you have a local rabbi, Rabbi Berel Wein, and he's very competent to answer the question for the local community. I'm a guest. I'm here for the winter. Doesn't matter who I am and what my capacity is. Here you have a local rabbi," which Rabbi Wein would repeat many times in many contexts. But if I tell you which contexts he said this, I'll probably get in trouble. So we'll leave it just at that. Rabbi Wein, of course, was very close with the Panovich Rav, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahanaman. I remember a story that he said that there was this former donor to Panovich Yeshiva who had finished all his savings. He was an old man and had finished his savings, and the only asset that he had left was this beautiful Miami Beach mansion. But he couldn't get a mortgage on it because he was old. So this person literally couldn't, this person had been wealthy his whole life. He had finished all his savings. He had been a very generous philanthropist, and he had helped Panovich Yeshiva and many other Torah institutions. And now, because the guy lived too long, he couldn't live. He couldn't live out the month. And the Panovich Rav decided to help him, that the Panovich Yeshiva would support him. And it was an amazing thing that he explained to Rabbi Wein that a yeshiva should do chesed too, to provide as gratitude to this donor for who had helped them all the years. And literally, the Panovich Rav wrote out a check to this person on a monthly basis to help him live for several years. And then, a cynic could say that he did this to have this in mind. Others would say that he did it l'shem shamayim. But I'm pretty sure he did it l'shem shamayim. I'm just leaving that aside for the cynics. But eventually this donor bequeathed his Miami Beach mansion to Panovich when he passed away. I remember just from the Miami days, I remember Rabbi Wein said a story about this old Litvak in Miami who he was very vigorous, well into his 90s. And Rabbi Wein asked him once, are you so energetic? You're such an elderly person and you're so full of life and energy. So he said, I'll tell you why. When I was very young, I grew up in Kovna. And when he grew up in Kovna, Rabbi Itzela Petterberger, Rabbi Itzela Blazer, the closest student of Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the Musar movement, he lived in Kovna at that time. And this old Litvak in Miami, he had danced with Rabbi Itzela Petterberger on Simchas Torah, holding Rabbi Itzela Petterberger's hand. Amazing thing, connection of the generations. And he was he's a wild kid. And by mistake, when they were dancing, because he was a little wild kid, he kicked Reb Itzela accidentally. So Reb Itzela Petterberger, the great Baal Musar, he leans over and he says to this little child, he says, "Sollst du haben lange Jahren, but please try not to kick me." He says, "You should live long, but please don't kick me." And you see, so I have a bracha from Reb Itzela Petterberger that I should live long, and that's how I'm so vigorous in my later years. A great story. There's this. One of the things that I found interesting was the way he viewed history. Was he said once about Haggadah of a Pesach illustrations. He pointed out how the Arba Banim, the 4 sons in the Haggadah, if you look at different Haggadahs throughout the world at different times in history, about how they illustrate the 4 sons, about what a tzaddik is supposed to look like, what a rasha is supposed to look like, and what a simple son, a tam, is supposed to look like, you really learn a lot about history. You see how history changes, and about how fashions, trends, and acculturation, modernization, it reflects historical realities. And it was things like that he pointed out that made you understand Jewish history in a broader picture, and how to find clues to Jewish history in a broader picture. I'll finish off with what he said, that if your grandparents and grandchildren are proud of you and who you are and what your values are and your accomplishments are, then you made it in life. So again, that's a broader view of Jewish history, that there's a certain continuity, a certain sense of generational, like I started off talking about as a representative of the silent generation. So here you look back at the previous generations and you look forward to the coming generations, and if they're all proud of who you are and what you stand for and what your values are, then you cemented your place in Jewish history. So that's a good Jewish historical lesson as well. This is Yehuda Geber, Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.